And now we are moving on to another fantastic presentation for you all with MCAT expert Dr. Ken Tao. This next presentation is for everyone who is taking the MCAT soon or planning to take it sometime in the future. And be sure to stay until the end because there will be free resources and discount codes given out for everyone here in attendance today. So without further ado, here is Dr. Ken Tao.
Thank you, Selena, for that fantastic introduction. So we are going to talk today about the MCAT, and just so I can get a sense of who I am speaking to today, in the chat, for all of you who are present, if you can go ahead and write in the chat when you're planning on taking the MCAT, that way I can see, are you taking the MCAT this year, this month, next year? It'll be really helpful for me to have a sense of who I'm speaking to. And I can see lots of responses rolling in. We've got 2024, January 2024, May of this year, spring of next year, next summer. All right, so we have a lot of you who are actually looking at taking the MCAT this year or next year. So that's fantastic because this information is going to be extremely relevant for all of you. Again, the topic is how to get a 99th percentile MCAT score, which I'm sure you would all love to achieve. So just to start, a little background about myself. My name is Ken. I am the director of MCAT for Med School Coach, and I have been in the MCAT space for about a decade. A bit of academic background for myself. I went to UC Berkeley for my undergraduate studies, where I majored in bioengineering as well as neurobiology. I then went to Harvard University for a PhD program in neuroscience. And yes, go Bears for those of you from UC Berkeley. And my PhD focused specifically on the neurobiology of the digestive system. So essentially how your brain controls digestion. I know a lot of you probably aren't thinking about how the brain controls digestion, but a very simple example is Pavlov's dog. You might recall from psychology that if you ring the bell, the dogs would salivate. So without having to taste the food or have the food in their mouth, they're already salivating. So of course, there's clearly some brain control of your digestive system. With regard to the MCAT, I said earlier, I've been doing this for a long time. I actually started out with the Princeton Review, and I was a senior MCAT instructor, premier MCAT tutor, instructor trainer, and content developer for the Princeton Review for 5 years. And then I was recruited by Med School Coach to start our MCAT program. We've been here for 5 years. So in total, I've got just over 10 years of experience with the MCAT. So I'm really happy to be here speaking with all of you and hope to share some really helpful information. In terms of the plan for today, we're going to start off by discussing what is a 99th percentile MCAT score, so you know what you're going to be aiming for. We're then going to discuss how to get a 99th percentile MCAT score. And finally, we're going to try to answer some of your questions. I know that we have another Q&A session later today that I'll be a part of at 3 p.m. Eastern. So if I'm not able to get to any of your questions today, we'll certainly get to them later this afternoon. All right, so to jump right in, what is a 99th percentile MCAT score? All of you should be aware that the MCAT follows a bell distribution. This is what we also call a normal curve. So that means in terms of the score, most students are going to be somewhere close to the middle, right? So the average used to be a 500, now it's about a 501.5. And with the bell distribution, that means very few students are getting really low scores and very few students are getting very high scores. If you want a 99th percentile MCAT score, that means you have to score better than 99% of all test takers, or that means you have to be the top 1% of all test takers. And with the most recent data from the AAMC, who are the creators of MCAT, that is an MCAT score of 522 to 528. So that's what you want to be shooting for if you want a 99th percentile MCAT score. The next thing I want to discuss, of course, is do you need a 99th percentile MCAT score? The answer is obviously not. You heard in the previous presentation that the MCAT is important, but there's a lot of other factors that medical school admissions committees will look into when reviewing the applications of all of you. So what I actually have here is data straight from the AMC, and this is a table that they have showing different MCAT and GPA combinations and what percentage of the students with those combinations were accepted to medical school. So for example, let's say you've got a 3.5 GPA and you score 508 on the MCAT. That would mean your GPA is between 3.4 to 3.59, and your MCAT is between 506 to 509. You can see here that 33.6% of students with those same statistics, MCAT and GPA, were accepted to medical school. So that gives you a sense of how to read the chart. And not surprisingly, the higher your GPA and the higher your MCAT, the higher the percentage of students who are getting accepted to medical school. So of course, you're certainly aiming for as high of a GPA and MCAT as possible. And you can see if you have the highest on this table, so a GPA greater than 3.79, MCAT greater than 517, you're looking at 84.2% of applicants were accepted to medical school. You also note that it's not 100% because clearly there are more factors than just the MCAT and GPA when it comes to admissions, but the MCAT and GPA certainly play an important role. Now, just to clarify, this data here is specifically for allopathic or MD medical schools. So if you're interested in other medical schools, such as osteopathic or DO medical schools, the numbers are slightly different, but they'll follow the same general trend. The higher your MCAT, the higher GPA, the higher the percentage of students who get accepted. Now, another question that I want to address while we're looking at this table is, if I've got a high GPA, can I get away with a low MCAT score? Or vice versa, if I have a lower GPA, can I crush the MCAT and can that make up for a lower GPA? You can actually evaluate that information just by looking at this table. So let's consider the first scenario. You have a really high GPA, greater than 3.79, but you didn't do so well on the MCAT. So let's say you're below average on the MCAT. We saw earlier, average on the MCAT was 501.5, so below average would be 498 to 501. You're looking at 28.3% of these students were accepted to medical school. That's not too bad, but it's also not great. If you worked so hard to get such an impressive GPA, my recommendation is if you didn't do so well on the MCAT, you should retake the exam because getting a higher score makes a huge difference in terms of your odds of getting accepted. Now, let's consider the opposite. Let's say you started university, the first few years were a bit rough, so you didn't do as well as you wanted in your college courses, so your GPA is a little bit lower than you want. Let's say it's a 3.1, right? So 3.1 GPA is not fantastic, but you crush the MCAT, you score greater than a 517, you're looking at 52.6%, which is pretty awesome, all right? So pretty much, if you've got a high GPA and a low MCAT, it's not so great, right? You should probably retake the exam. But if you're a student where your college courses have been a bit tough, the weeder courses in your freshman and sophomore years with organic chemistry and physics didn't go too well, you shouldn't feel too discouraged because if you do amazing on the MCAT, that can absolutely make up for that lower GPA. All right. And the last thing I'm just going to point out is the MCAT makes a pretty big difference in terms of higher scores and what percentage of students get accepted. If you simply take a look at this table, just anywhere you're on the table, if you were just to bump up your score by a few points, you can see how many percentage points you increase in terms of the percentage of students that get accepted. So hopefully from this table, you can recognize that MCAT is important and you want to do as well as you can. From here, I want to talk about how to get a 99th percentile MCAT score. So this is not so easy, right? Because there's a lot of you here, but you know that if it's only the top 1% of test takers, clearly not everyone here can be among the top 1% of test takers. That being said, if you can learn a bit about how 99th percentile MCAT scorers approach the MCAT, then you can try to apply some of those approaches yourself. And maybe you don't get a 99th percentile MCAT score, but if you can get a 90th percentile, 95th percentile MCAT score, that's still really, really good. So I do want to talk about some of the ways that 99th percentile MCAT scores study for the MCAT, and that starts with creating an effective study plan. There's a lot of students that when they're studying for the exam, they pretty much just say, okay, let me grab a set of MCAT books, let me start reading through the chapters. What often happens to these students is when they don't have a plan, the content review takes them longer than they expect, right? And typically they go into this situation where like, oh, my exam's in about a month, I better start doing some practice problems. So they start doing practice problems, but at that point it's too late and they take the exam, they don't get the score they want. And what I always hear from these students is, oh, I spent too much time on content review. I should have, done more practice, right? And then they tell other people, oh, don't do content review, just do practice problems. That's all you need to score better. But in reality, that's not how studying for the MCAT works, right? It's not like you do content review or practice. A good study plan should incorporate both, and an effective study plan maps everything out on a study calendar. So you can see on the slide, here's an example calendar that we use for planning out the study plans of all of the students that we help with at Med School Coach. The way this calendar is set up is it maps out exactly what you need to do for each day of your studies, what book chapters you need to read, what practice problems you need to complete, what practice problems you need to review, and so forth. The importance of having the study schedule is it holds you accountable to your studies, because as you go through each day, you got to check off, did I complete the study item or not? And if you're completing each item each day, then great. You're not going to run into any issue where you don't have enough content review or don't have enough practice. But again, because many students don't use such a study plan, they often aren't able to complete everything that they need in order to do well on the exam. So that's the first thing. If you want to do well on the exam, you need to make sure you go in with an effective study plan. Number two, review the science content over and over again. For the MCAT, there is a lot of science content that is tested, and more than any student is used to from a single final exams or a single semester of final exams, right? You've got a year of general chemistry, a year of organic chemistry, a year of physics, a year of general biology, one semester each of psychology and sociology, as well as biochemistry. That's so much content that there's no way that you can review the science content once and expect to have all of that science content memorized. So for 99th percentile MCAT scores, they know that they have to review the science content over and over again, and they specifically build into their study plan times for them to review the science content over and over again. So for example, amino acids is one of the highest yield concepts on the exam. If you don't review amino acids at least 5 to 10 times, you're not studying for the MCAT like a 99th percentile MCAT score. And what you can actually see on the slide is our first promo for all of you that are here today. Again, I've got lots of you in the chat, so I'm going to ask, first of all, has anyone here heard of the MCAT Basics podcast? For those of you on iOS devices, this is in our podcast app, or for those of you who are on our Android devices, you can find it in any podcast app. And I can already see a whole bunch of you typing in the chat. You've all heard of the MCAT Basics podcast. You love the podcast. It's a great tool. I'm thrilled that you guys all like MCAT Basics. It's a fantastic resource. And if you haven't heard of it, just go to these apps, look up MCAT Basics podcast. It was a podcast created by Sam Smith, who was studying for the MCAT and decided the best way for himself to study was to record himself explaining these science concepts. And he released the podcast, student loved it. And he decided that at Med School Coach, he wanted to create a comprehensive audio course. So if you like the MCAT Basics podcast, you're going to love MCAT Go. And right now in the chat, I'm going to drop for everyone a link that you can use to redeem your first month of access to MCAT Go for just $1. And again, if you like MCAT Basics, you're really, really going to enjoy MCAT Go. It's a comprehensive audio course that covers all of the key science concepts on the exam. So if you have spare time, if you want to study for the MCAT in your spare time, for example, if you're at the gym and you're working out, but you want to do some studying, if you're doing chores, if you're commuting, MCAT Go is an excellent way to get in some extra study done. All right. Next, we have effective use of study resources. So all of you should know that we have different study resources that are available for studying for the exam. And having the resources is great, but using them effectively is a different story. So what I mean by that is if you're using a set of MCAT books, you don't just say, oh, I'm using a set of MCAT books. You want to make sure that you're using your MCAT books effectively, all right? So when it comes to your MCAT books, if you purchase them and let them sit on your shelf and collect dust, then it's not going to be very helpful, right? What you really want to do is you want to use the study resources effectively, and there are different ways that you can use those resources effectively. And here, I want to talk about one particular resource that a lot of students use, which is flashcards. Now, flashcards are great because they help you to review the science content and help you to memorize the science content you need to know for the exam, but there are different levels of using flashcards to be more effective. So the most basic level, number one, is to use pre-made flashcards. So if you download flashcards online, or if you purchase a deck of flashcards made by a test prep company, you're using flashcards. But again, that's really the most basic level of using flashcards. The reason why is because you're not making your own flashcards. That's really level two. Why is making your flashcards important? Well, there's a lot of studies out there that have shown that half the benefit of flashcards comes from making the flashcards in the first place. And the reason why is because if you create the flashcards, it's forcing you to summarize the science content in your own words. And by doing so, it's allowing you to process the information and making sure you understand the science content, as opposed to just using flashcards made by someone else. All right, so level one is just using pre-made flashcards. Level two is creating your own flashcards. Level three is optimizing your flashcards. I see a lot of students use flashcards, but a lot of their flashcards aren't really helpful for them. For example, I mentioned earlier that amino acids are really important for the exam. What a lot of students will do with their flashcards is on one side, they write amino acids, and on the other side, they're just going to have all 20 amino acids. And honestly, that's not very helpful because you're not just going to have one card and be able to recite all 20 amino acids and all the important information that you need to know about those flashcards. So if you want to make better flashcards, you certainly need to have a single card per amino acid, and each card needs to have the relevant science information you need to know about them. For example, you might say, all right, glycine. Glycine's on one side of the flashcard. What do I have on the other side? I have gly, the 3-letter code, G, the 1-letter code. You have the structure of the amino acid, showing that the side chain is hydrogen, meaning that the amino acid is achiral. And due to its small side chain, glycine is very flexible, so it is able to disrupt secondary structure, right? That is an example of an effective study card that is optimized and contains all of the information that you need to know. All right, so you want to make flashcards, but it's not just making any flashcards. You need to make good flashcards. And the last thing is to use proven review strategies. And when you want to use proven review strategies, what I mean by this is because the MCAT covers so many semesters worth of science content, it's impossible for you to create physical flashcards for each. Well, I'm not saying it's impossible, you can, but I'm saying is if you create physical flashcards for every single science content concept for the MCAT, you're going to end up with thousands of flashcards. And if you're creating physical flashcards using note cards, you're going to have a mountain of flashcards. And at that point, it becomes very impractical to review every single flashcard. You have no idea which flashcards you have memorized and which flashcards you don't have memorized. So I'm going to ask right now for those of us in the chat, if you have used Anki before, let me know, because I'm guessing if you're studying for MCAT, hopefully you have heard of Anki. It is a fantastic MCAT resource, and I can see the chat coming live again. Lots of people mentioning that they have used Anki. Now, what do I mean by proven review strategies? Well, Anki incorporates what is called a spaced repetition algorithm. The spaced repetition algorithm allows you to spend more time reviewing the Anki cards that you don't have memorized and less time on the Anki cards that you do have memorized. And that is spelled ANKI. It is really the highest level when it comes to using MCAT flashcards as a study resource. And again, I'm explaining this just for flashcards, but the same applies for all of the other study resources. All right, next, practice like a 99th percentile student. So I said earlier, you need to know your content review. You need to know your science, so you need to do your content review. I also said that you need to do practice. Doing practice problems is one thing, but practicing like a 99th percentile student is a very different thing. So if you want to make sure that you're practicing like a 99th percentile MCAT student, the key thing is making sure that you are taking lots of practice exams. For a lot of students, when they're doing practice, they're like, oh, let me just, find 15 minutes. I'm going to do a practice passage. Or, oh, this afternoon, I want to do, 2 passages, right? It's good that you do regular passage, but make sure that you aren't just doing small sets of practice at a time. The reason why is because if you only do a few practice passages or practice questions at a time, you never develop two key skills for success in the MCAT. And that is number one, stamina. The MCAT is a 7.5 hour exam. If you don't practice like you're going to test on test day, you're never going to be able to maintain focus throughout all 4 sections of the exam. And number two, you're not going to learn how to pace yourself. There's so many students that when they're studying for the exam, they take practice exams and they find themselves spending too much time on the first few passages and running out of time on the later passages. If that's you, you're running out of time on the exam, it means you haven't learned pacing skills. And the biggest shame of running out of time is you spent a lot of time on some really hard questions. The last passage, the last few sets of questions, there are always going to be some easy questions in there. So if you really want to optimize your score, you need to build up stamina and you also need to learn how to pace yourself. And the best way to do that is by taking a lot of practice exams. And this is where we've got our next giveaway for all of you here today as a thank you for being present for this presentation. Med School Coach, we've got full-length MCAT practice exams. They fully simulate the MCAT testing situation. So it's got the separation where you see the passages on the left hand and the questions on the right hand. It's got the highlight feature, the strike through feature, the flag question feature, all of the features for our MCAT practice exams, you're going to find to be extremely useful for your studies. And you can see here that we have a promo code here. It's the same as the last one, MAR 2023 PME. You can use this link that I'm going to put in the chat. You can click that link. It will automatically add the practice exam. And if you simply enter that code MAR 2023 PME, you're going to be able to redeem access to this practice exam for free. Again, this exam is completely free, so there's no reason why every single one of you who are here with us today does not redeem this practice exam. So highly recommend, check out that link, redeem that practice exam. Once you redeem that practice exam, you've got that practice exam for whenever you need. So if you're not taking the MCAT until this summer, that's fine. You can save the exam from then. If you're not taking the MCAT until next year, you can still save that practice exam for then. And you're going to find that by doing this practice exam, it'll be a helpful part of your studies. All right, next item, reviewing questions like a 99th percentile student. It's one thing to complete practice problems, but you can't just complete practice problems and expect your score to improve. So you do need to complete the practice problems, but you need to review the questions properly to make sure that you're able to learn from your mistakes. Now, in this case, I've got an example of a CARS question. The reason why I have an example of a CARS question is because so many students, when they look at a CARS question, they pretty much just give up and say, oh, it's reading comprehension, right? I pretty much just had to understand the passage or I'm going to get the question wrong. Well, that's not exactly how it works. The CARS section, even though it doesn't test any knowledge of science content, and it also doesn't test any knowledge of humanities content or social studies content, it is testing reasoning skills that are reproducible across any passage topic, right? So what I mean by this is a lot of students, when they're completing CARS practice, they usually blame their performance on the passage topic. They say, oh, on this CARS exam, I did pretty well, but what really messed me up was this passage on philosophy or art theory. I just couldn't understand the text. I couldn't understand the passage. And that's why I scored poorly on the exam. But for those students, they're focusing too much on the content of those passages, which is those humanities and social studies topics. And in reality, the MCAT doesn't expect you to have any knowledge of philosophy or art theory. What the MCAT expects you to know instead are reasoning skills. Now, what are reasoning skills? It's essentially how to construct a good argument. Now, in this case, here is an example question, and the question is, the argument made by the author in paragraph 2 would be most strengthened if it included. So the first thing you want to point out is, what is this question asking you to do? It's asking you how you can strengthen the argument. If it's asking you how to strengthen the argument, that means there is an argument flaw in the question. Now, argument flaws can be in multiple forms. And two of the most common ones is when they provide a claim, but they don't provide evidence, all right? You can't just say, oh, the MCAT is the hardest exam in the world, but not provide any evidence because no one is going to believe your argument. Another way that your argument can be flawed is if you make a claim, but elsewhere in the passage, you state a contradicting claim. If you contradict yourself, that is also an argument flaw. So in this case in particular, in paragraph 2, if you read the text, you would see that there are two claims being made here, which is the selection of McCain and Palin further indicated the weakened position of liberal conservatives in the Republican Party, and this was a situation that did not sit well with the financial sector. If you continue to read the paragraph, you'll see that they provided evidence for one of these two claims, which is that Obama, the opposition party, received more campaign contributions from the financial sector. So you have evidence for one claim, but not the other claim. So how could you strengthen this argument? Well, you can provide evidence for the other claim that did not have support, which is why in this case, the answer is A. Now, in this case, the way I went through this question may be very different from the way that you're used to thinking about CARS questions. Because again, most students, when they're thinking about CARS questions, they're just like, oh, what was the passage about? The passage was about politics, about Republicans and Democrats, right? And they're focused too much on the content of the passage, when really the AAMC is focused on reasoning skills. So in this case, if you wanted to review this question properly, you wanted to note that this question is what the AMC calls a reasoning within the text question. And specifically, it's about argument flaws. In terms of why you missed the question, it can be for a variety of reasons. You misread the question, you misread the solutions, misread the answer choices, or maybe you didn't understand the passage. But the key thing you want to know is, what can you do so you can answer the question correctly, which in this case, again, is focusing on the reasoning skills. So the reasoning skills is to recognize that an argument needs to include both a claim and support/evidence. And more importantly, an argument may be strengthened if you include support/evidence. So this way, the next time you see this kind of question, you're not focusing exclusively on what is the passage about, you're focusing specifically on the reasoning skills. Now, if this is a way with CARS that you have not seen before, focusing on reasoning skills of what the specific types of questions are asking you, you're not alone, because this is a common mistake made by a lot of students. And this is something that you can actually learn. And the way you can learn it is through an MCAT CARS course. So this is actually the last giveaway we have for today's presentation, which is, for those of you, if you know that CARS is one of your areas of weaknesses, this is a section you can absolutely improve on. For a lot of students, when it comes to CARS, their general approach is just to do more CARS practice, hoping that at some point their score is going to improve. But in reality, for most of these students, rather than getting more CARS practice, what they really need is they need more CARS expertise to learn what the CARS section tests you, what are the different question types, and what are the different reasoning skills. So we have such an MCAT CARS course. It's got 40 lessons, with reinforcing learning questions. And it is incredibly helpful for students studying for the CARS section of the exam. And as our final giveaway for all of you for attending this presentation, we have the same code as before, MAR 2023 MCAT, and 2023 PME. And again, if you go to, oops, I copied the wrong link. If you take a look at the chat, we have a link that you can use with the promo code MAR 2023 PME to get access to our MCAT CARS course with a $100 discount. These codes are only going to be active through midnight today, so if you're interested, definitely sign up. Otherwise, I hope this presentation was helpful.